Thank you very much. So, at the fear that some of you guys might end up falling asleep from that wonderful lunch during the middle of my rather probably boring talk, my suggestion was I'd have everyone get up, don a pair of purple leotards, and we'd also do some liturgical dance exercises. No? Okay, maybe you're awake now. All right. So thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction. That's all the time I had. No. I'm trying to become a morning comedian. It's not working out yet. So anyways, so I'm talking about today Mediator Dei and the liturgical movement. And we're going to be reviewing this magnificent encyclical of Pope Pius XII on the sacred liturgy. And kind of as an overview to this is, if this encyclical had been heeded, we never would have had the new Mass. It's as simple as that. And as we're going to see, everything that is condemned in Mediator Dei, you see in the new Mass. So it's going to be interesting. So specifically, I want to show in this conference how Mediator Dei provides guidelines in matters liturgical. So two things is how the legitimate objectives of the liturgical movement were in line with tradition. And this is in Mediator Dei. And again, how the Novus Ordo departed from these principles. Now, there's going to be 5 focal points to my conference. First, I'm going to do an outline of the encyclical. Second, I'm going to give you a short background of the liturgical movement. Third, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the liturgical reforms that were made after the encyclical's publication that comprised the 1962 editions of the liturgical books. So the 1962 Missale Romanum that is most commonly used. Fourth, how the Novus Ordo does not conform with Mediator Dei. And then fifth, how we continue to carry on the legitimate work of the liturgical movement. So I can only address each of these points very briefly. It would take literally several conferences to cover each one sufficiently, and even sub-conferences to other conferences. So unfortunately, I'll only be summarizing on these points in order to give an overall picture. Now, first I want to start out with an overview of the encyclical. The encyclical Mediator Dei is unfortunately often overlooked, even by promoters of the traditional Roman Mass, the traditional liturgy. It was published by Pope Pius XII on November 20th, 1947. It's the first encyclical that was ever completely devoted to the topic of the sacred liturgy. And it's considered to be one of Pius XII's greatest encyclicals. It's lengthy and comprehensive. It's 210 paragraphs long. And I have to say, preparing for this conference was very daunting because trying to cherry pick the best citations was very difficult to do because it's such a magnificent piece and it addresses so much. So hopefully I can do some justice to this encyclical here. Now, the full text of Mediator Dei is available at my website, which is romanitaspress.com. You can come to my website, get a business card, and it's got it on there. I published it on there actually in preparation for this conference. Plus, I want people to have it as a reference, as a go-to, because it is a very important encyclical for many reasons. Get this to work. Okay, I could extensively quote from this encyclical, as I said, but there's going to just be a few. So I have to encourage all of you, please take some time to read this encyclical someday soon. I don't expect you to walk out of the hotel today, go up to my website and start reading it. It's going to take you about an hour, by the way, to read it, okay, to read it well. But please, make it a goal of yours at some point to make this part of your requisite reading. It will be worth your while. Particularly what I love about this encyclical is the theological explanations on the liturgy and its importance for our sanctification. There's particularly for priests, if you ever want to refer this to priests, there's some beautiful, beautiful explanations about the priesthood in there, okay, on this. Now, the title Mediator Dei actually comes or translates into English as mediator of God. It indicates the centrality of Christ's redemptive role through the sacred liturgy, specifically the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And to quote from the introduction, quote, "Mediator between God and men, and high priest who has gone before us into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, quite clearly had one aim in view when he undertook the mission of mercy, which was to endow mankind with the rich blessings of supernatural grace. Sin had disturbed the right relationship between man and his Creator. The Son of God would restore it. For this reason, he was not content while he dwelt with us on earth, merely to give notice that redemption had begun and to proclaim the long-awaited kingdom of God, but gave himself besides in prayer and sacrifice to the task of saving souls, even to the point of offering himself as he hung from the cross, a victim unspotted unto God, to purify our conscience of dead works, to serve the living God. But what is more, the divine Redeemer has so willed it that the priestly life begun with the supplication and sacrifice of his mortal body should continue without intermission down the ages in his mystical body, which is the church. That is why he established a visible priesthood to offer everywhere the clean oblation, which would enable men from east to west, freed from the shackles of sin, to offer God that unconstrained and voluntary homage which their conscience dictates. In obedience, therefore, to her founder's behest, the Church prolongs the priestly mission of Jesus Christ mainly by means of the sacred liturgy. So now we're going to talk briefly about the historical context of this encyclical, Mediator Dei, in regards to the liturgical movement. Because part of the emphasis behind this encyclical is to actually give some emphasis to the liturgical movement. So we need to understand a little bit of the historical context of the liturgical movement itself that preceded this encyclical of 1947. Now, I'm not going to have time to cover the full history, the figures, controversies, all that stuff. They're all part of the liturgical movement. That would literally take many conferences to do. It's a fascinating subject. There are some books that are out there, give or take a little bit. Sometimes you have to read it, with reading between the lines and such like that. But there's a lot of information out there on this topic. And if you can sift through it, you can sift through it. Now, unfortunately, there's rather a dim view of the liturgical movement by many in tradition. In fact, some people see red at the mere mention of such phrases as active participation, congregational singing, and especially the dialogue Mass. It's almost a type of post-traumatic stress syndrome, in fact. And it's understandable that this would happen considering the reaction that's taking place to the abuses and errors that people have experienced through the new Mass. But it's crucial that we understand that what the Novus Ordo implemented as active participation is not the same as the authentic notion that was initially that of the liturgical movement, and that which is also endorsed and promoted by the saints, particularly St. Pius X, the popes, not the saints. The popes, St. Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, and up to Pius XII. And of course, John the 23rd for the limited role that he did as well. There's also a case where sometimes we have people fall back on their lifetime experiences and they'll say, well, that's not what we did back in the 50s. But as we'll see in Mediator Dei, we see precisely what the popes are exhorting to take place as a sense of renewal, and they make clear what their desires are. And just a quick side note is, for instance, St. Pius X, even though he wrote strongly about the restoration of Gregorian chant and congregational singing in parishes, unfortunately, it was not only dismissed and ignored, it was even disobeyed, such to the point that successive popes continued to write to say, this is tragic that this is still taking place. So, in opposing the liturgical movement also, as well as its initiatives, some will point to the related personalities who did, in some cases, compromise on theological matters or in inventing the new Mass. And therefore, they make the assessment that, A, the liturgical movement's legitimate efforts should just be ignored, discarded, or B, active participation must be a bad thing. However, when we're dealing with persons of the liturgical movement, there's two crucial principles that we need to recall. And I love to cite these all the time when I'm dealing with liturgical matters, especially in the 20th century. And the first one is God can draw straight with crooked lines. He's done that throughout history. There's always been a time where maybe we had a bad pope or a bad bishop or ineffective pope or ineffective bishop, ineffective priest, and yet God has still used them in one way or the other. 2, a broken clock is absolutely correct twice a day. So, I mean, there's even things that Pope Francis says that are correct, okay? Unfortunately, we don't get to hear about those as much as often as we'd like to, all right? So thus, even if these same persons started well but ended badly, such as falling into a theological error or assisting the concilium in creating the new Mass, we still need to go through and say, well, what were they doing right once upon a time? What were they saying that was right that was once upon? So we got to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, which can be a very easy and convenient thing to do, all right? It's imperative we make correct and proper distinctions. This is a hallmark of Catholicism, all right, is making all these proper distinctions. And, for example, in Mediator Dei, Pius XII himself does this. He makes these proper distinctions. He corrects the errors, and he invites those who are in error to come back to the road of sanity. So he didn't just dump the liturgical movement, even when they saw there's some things going astray here with some of these guys. Okay, but no, he held to it and said, this is where you guys need to get back to. So what brought about the liturgical movement in the first place? And we got to go back to a little bit of history. So throughout the 17th and 19th centuries, there occurred a tragic dissolution of centers of liturgical life. This is your thing. No, it's my thing. It's my wife. I'm in trouble. You haven't finished your conference yet? What are you doing to these people? No. Okay, they're falling asleep, Lewis. All right, so during the 17th and 19th centuries, we had this tragic dissolution of centers of liturgical life throughout Europe collapse. This was a result of not only the Protestant Reformation, but then being followed upon by various social upheavals, political persecutions of the church, whether it was the French Revolution, anti-clerical movements, all these kind of things that were going on. And particularly affected were monastic institutions such as the Benedictines or even Augustinians. And these monasteries had exercised great influence in the liturgical piety amongst the faithful. Okay, they would go to these monasteries regularly. There would be solemn masses, sung masses almost every single day at these places. They would go to Vespers. You'd have the other exercises like benediction and everything going on, okay? And just to give you an idea how bad it was, by the early 19th century, the number of abbeys in Europe had decreased from over 1,500 to only about 30. This was the state of things when Dom Guéranger came on the scene. By the way, I wasn't going to talk about this, but we recently had the tragedy at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Now imagine what happened in Reformation England. Pre-Reformation England had more abbeys per ratio than all of Europe combined. It was wiped out. It was wiped out once the Church of England came on the scene. And many of those places are ruins. Some of those places don't exist anymore. But and if you imagine the great treasures of sacred art that were lost in England. For instance, the reports from the contemporary reports of the time, of the Middle Ages, was Glastonbury Cathedral had superior stained glass windows to anything in France. So we laud about what's in France at Chartres and Notre Dame and all those places, but England was even better, they said. So, and this is coming from people who actually had seen all these places at that time when these things had been erected. So you can imagine the great tragedy we have lost historically, artistically, throughout Europe. And the French Revolution ravaged a lot of France as well, too, plus many other places. That's just on the artistic level. Now let's talk about the liturgical level, okay? Because what happened was once these monastic communities collapsed, these faithful now, what were they getting for the liturgy? Well, you couldn't do solemn masses anymore. There weren't huge choirs of monks to carry out the Gregorian chant, to carry out the solemn ceremonies, with a priest, deacon, and subdeacon. And in some cases, parish churches were even closed. I mean, we get to the period of St. Vincent, and there's a parish he gets assigned to. They hadn't had a priest for how many years? He had to take the rectory back, for instance, from vagabonds who were camping out in there, okay? St. John Vianney, same thing. Okay, so these areas are being ravaged. They don't even have parishes in some cases. If they do have a parish, most likely all they're having now is low mass. So what all these previous practices that we kind of think were just reinvented, like congregational singing and dialogue mass, they're actually from that time period, but it all disappeared because these monastic communities went and the parish life went and all that other stuff. Simultaneous almost its entire collapse of these monastic institutions throughout Europe is the infection of the Protestant error of pietism, and it began to come into the church. And this is an error that emanated firstly from the denial of the necessity of the Catholic Church for salvation. And we know that the church is the perfect form of society. So then as a result, philosophers then began to say, actually Calvinists first, they began to deny a principle of the natural law that man is a social creature. All right? So then they began to reject the necessity of sacred liturgy. And the word liturgy comes from the Greek word liturgia, which refers to rendering a public act of duty, which in this case is the worship that it belongs to God. It's part of the moral virtue of religion. So what you started seeing rising at this time was this just me and Jesus thing you hear about today, only it was more intelligently expressed. But that's what's going on, and it's affecting the minds of Catholics, both clergy and laity alike, who began to take less and less value into the liturgy and more into, I can just do it on my own. I don't have to get together as a corporate body, as the mystical body of Christ, to offer up this act of religion to God. So the combination of the dissolution of liturgical life and the affection of pietism led to these traditional practices of our ancestors at Mass, and as well as even the divine office, because they used to frequently go to Vespers, we know, to diminish and even cease. Now, as I said before, this is a situation that Dom Prosper Garanger came about in the scene of the 1820s, a young priest who decided to become a Benedictine. He eventually became the famed 40-year abbot and restorer of the Salems Monastery, which he found in ruins, and rebuilt it back up. He was the author of, as many of you know, the 15-volume set called The Liturgical Year, which Loretto Publications reprinted, and you can still get. I highly recommend that. I mean, 15 volumes is a lot, but this is what the father of St. Teresa of Lisieux read to his children. And out of that, they got all these vocations and everything. Tom Garanger passed away in 1875, did an enormous amount of work in his time, and rightfully should be considered as the grandfather of the liturgical movement. There were others that were involved as well, too. The 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by the great revival and interest in liturgical studies, which Dom Garanger was instrumental in putting into motion. So these liturgical studies were looking into the historical development, the foundations, and the practices of the sacred liturgy, both in the East and in the West. Also, what happened at this time, too, is many previously unknown liturgical sources were discovered in monasteries or libraries or wherever it was over the next 150 years, which added or augmented this work that was going on, these studies. And Pius XII praised these academic efforts in Mediator Dei, quote, "The majestic ceremonies of the sacrifice of the altar became better known, understood, and appreciated. With more widespread and more frequent reception in sacraments, with the beauty of the liturgical prayers more fully savored, the worship of the Eucharist came to be regarded for what it really is, the fountainhead of genuine Christian devotion. Bolder relief was given likewise to the fact that all the faithful make up a single and very compact body with Christ for its head, and that the Christian community is in duty bound to participate in the liturgical rites according to their station," unquote. So already he's starting to make distinctions here about, well, what is the laity's role, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. Another early initiative of what would become part of the liturgical movement was the restoration of Gregorian or Roman chant. It's a very lengthy topic, but essentially Gregorian chant had fallen into destitute. It nearly went extinct. That's how bad it got. And its restoration was desperately needed. Luckily, we had guys, the Benedictines, the Benedictine order in particular, rose up to the challenge, and they were successful in getting Gregorian chant restored to the Roman Church. In 1903, we had St. Pius X's motu proprio on the restoration of sacred music, Tra le Sollecitudini, which gave further impetus to restoring chant in the church. The document introduced the phrase of active participation, axuozio partioziosa, as he says in Italian, and he also sought to restore this sense of liturgical worship to the faithful. So when you hear that word active participation, please don't have a knee-jerk reaction and think new Mass, because it's actually coming from St. Pius X himself. And there is a correct understanding to that, which the Novus Ordo unfortunately hijacked that term to use for what they're doing today, which we'll talk about more. So this growing interest in restoring the liturgy, better understanding the liturgy, to the forefront of Christian life began to gel into a movement. And the liturgical movement, you could say, had its beginnings in June of 1910, when the first liturgical week was held at Mount Chisard Monastery in Belgium. And it was rather successful, and the initial declared goal of this newly founded liturgical movement was, quote, "to restore Christian spirituality, and the means proposed was the restoration of the parochial High Mass on Sunday with full participation." So basically a High Mass that's sung with incense and with all the faithful chanting their proper parts. This is what their main goal right now is to restore. Okay, very simple. So therefore, the liturgical movement specifically took up St. Pius X's initiative of restoring active participation, which became a hallmark of this movement, so to speak. It was probably their biggest objective of all. And in fact, this, as I mentioned earlier, this active participation was merely a restoration of the former practices that had been lost from the effects or attacks on the Catholic Church that we previously spoke about. And history, by the way, testifies to these, to the faithful singing at Mass on a regular basis and even making responses at low Masses. And I cover this. I have a 2-part article that I did. It was published in The Remnant a few years back. It's part of how Brian McCall and I got acquainted with each other, was this discussion on the dialogue Mass. And in there, I address a lot of the misconceptions that surround the liturgy that some people seem to have, which seem for some reason to get focused on the whole dialogue Mass, how that happens. So I would urge you to, even if you don't like the dialogue Mass, okay, that's fine. It's your preference. My caveat to people is if you can't do it well, please don't do it, because it just gives a bad name to it. But it can excite devotion amongst the faithful. It can certainly help to draw the attention. I especially have seen this with youngsters, especially in schools, where when they implement it well, the dialogue Mass in school Masses, boy, does it have an effect. And the teachers have noticed it too. I know one school where teachers who have not been exposed to a dialogue Mass before have come to this school where the school Masses are dialogued, And then they noticed that the students actually are paying attention to the Mass. They were paying attention to the readings in their book, and they actually are better acquainted with the Mass. The whole thing just kind of works together, all right? And I was going to say there are plenty of historical documentation to prove this. It's not something, a rabbit we've pulled out of our head. In fact, Pius XI mentioned specifically in Divini Cultus these practices. It's an earlier document that's related to the liturgy. Again, he's trying to exhort and encourage people to take up active participation. This was prior to Mediator Dei. The other proof, by the way, that these were the ancient traditions of our forefathers is the fact that in the East, they still remain the universal practice. This concept of just going to Mass as a muted spectator is completely foreign to them. That they would say, are you out of your mind? That's crazy. They're always singing. There's always a dialogue going back between them and the deacon or the celebrant, okay, or maybe a subdeacon even, all right? So they never lost that in the East because they were separated not just by land, but also they were isolated from the Protestant Reformation to some degree, okay? It's an interesting historical thing that occurred there. Now, the objectives of the liturgical movement continually were supported by various popes from St. Pius X up to John the 23rd. Unfortunately, they always encountered resistance. And I like to call the resistors of these initiatives, so the popes, I call them the intransigent pietists. All right, and they just said, no, we just want low Mass. We don't want any singing. We don't want any participation. Just leave us alone. Let me bury my head and do my own little private devotion, whatever that might be. I don't even want to use a hand missal. And so you had going on here arguments going on between the people in favor of the objectives of these popes, which was embodied by the liturgical movement, and then the people who we just want to ignore it, okay? And as I said before, even St. Pius X's directives for restoring Gregorian chant were just being ignored. He says, as incredible as that may seem, he was being ignored, and he was even being made fun of, criticized. So Pius X was keen to support and encourage the work of the liturgical movement while correcting errors that had crept in from both sides. In fact, one of his opening paragraphs is, I need to correct some errors that are starting to get into the liturgical movement. But you intransigent pietists don't think that I'm supporting you guys either, because you're being lazy and don't want to do what we're asking you to do. So he gives it to both, with both barrels, to both sides. So one of the first quotes he gives is, quote, but while we derive no little satisfaction from the wholesome results of the movement just described, the liturgical movement, duty obliges us to give serious attention to this revival as it is advocated in some quarters, and to take proper steps to preserve it at the outset from excess or outright perversion, unquote, which, as we'll see later, that's exactly what happened with the new Mass. Is everyone still awake? All right, good. Because now we're going to examine briefly the encyclical contents. Like I said before, Mediator Dei is a lengthy encyclical, covers many points touching on the sacred liturgy. Simply do not have enough time to consider all of them. Again, please read it for yourself. You're in for a treat. So I want to quickly summarize some of its points, and I want to also briefly examine some of the main errors it condemns. So starting out on a positive note, so Mediator Dei, 1, taught that the liturgy is the primary source of our sanctification. 2, it stressed the primacy of interior worship. It's too bad Father Albert's not here as a Dominican, because the whole thing of contemplation and preaching and liturgy all goes together with them, specifically to their order. But every religious order has that, but the Dominicans have that specific charism for them. 3, declared the Holy Eucharist as the culmination and center of our Catholic religion. 4, addresses the importance of the priesthood for continuing Christ's redemptive acts through the sacred liturgy. 5, describes the 4 ends of the Mass. 6, stressed importance of the faithful actively participating in Mass by singing, responding, such as a dialogue Mass, making the proper postures at Mass, and the use of hand missals. 7, explained how fruits of Holy Communion are increased by preparation and thanksgiving. And so he specifically exhorts the faithful, don't just leave the church right after Mass. Stay for a while. Make a good Thanksgiving. In fact, some of the saints are usually, they give like 5 minutes, okay? Spend at least 5 minutes with our Lord afterwards. So another important point, spiritual point that he makes. 8, praise those who promoted devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. 9, reinforce the use of Latin in liturgical services as not only a source of unity, but also a sure guard protector of doctrine. 10, included the divine office, specifically Vespers, with Mass as part of the church's liturgical life that even the laity should participate in to some degree. And by an interesting side note, it used to be debated amongst moral theologians once before the Code of Canon Law of 1917 actually resolved it. But it used to be the teaching that Sunday Mass wasn't alone for your obligation. Vespers in the evening was too. So that wasn't resolved until the 1917 Code of Canon Law was actually codified under Pius X. 11, specified that the liturgical year should revolve around the mysteries of Christ's life. And again, the liturgical year by Dom Guéranger, excellent resource for that. Another thing that I offer, you can download as MP3 files from my website. They're called Franciscan Meditations, but they're really liturgical meditations through the eyes of Franciscan spirituality. They're beautiful, done by Father Gobel, who is a Capuchin. So you can go, again, to romanitaspress.com and download those meditations and listen to them whenever you want to on your mobile device. Just not during my conference, please. And then finally, 12. Pius XII recommended extra liturgical devotions to increase piety. They're kind of linked together almost in a way. Pius XII also used Mediator Dei to counter some errors that were cropping up concerning the liturgy. So first, Pope Pius XII reiterated a fundamental principle of the sacred liturgy with the Latin phrase or axiom, legem credendi lex statua supplicandi. Let the rule of prayer determine the rule of belief. And he actually reverses it as well, that the law of belief should also dictate the law of prayer. So he uses it in both ways in this encyclical. It's very interesting what he does. So to give you a quote to further this point about lex credendi, lex orandi, quote, the entire liturgy, therefore, has the Catholic faith for its content, inasmuch as it bears public witness to the faith of the Church. We observe with considerable anxiety that certain enthusiasts, overeager in their search for novelty, are straying beyond the path of sound doctrine and prudence. Not seldom, in fact, they interlard their plans and hopes for a revival of the sacred liturgy with principles that compromise this holiest of causes in theory or practice, and sometimes even taint it with errors touching Catholic faith and ascetical doctrine. Yet, the integrity of faith and morals ought to be the special criterion of this sacred science, which must conform exactly to what the Church, out of the abundance of her wisdom, teaches and prescribes. It is consequently our prerogative to commend and approve whatever is done properly, and to check or censure any aberration from the path of truth and rectitude, unquote. Also interesting is Pius XII prescribed the notion that the liturgy is a sort of proving ground for the doctrine, for doctrine. So therefore, since you find it in the liturgy, therefore it must be doctrine. But he does make the distinction that obviously the liturgy has helped to forward the development of doctrine. He speaks specifically to the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, for instance, because of how that was explicated in some of the liturgical texts. He also condemns the error of antiquarianism. Now, antiquarianism is this hankering after older things just because they're old. They savors of novelty. There's an aura and a mystique put around it. And to be honest, actually, antiquarianism is not new to the Church. It didn't just pop up in the 20th century. Dom Guéranger had to deal with this under the form of Neo-Gallicanism in his time, because what happened at that time was a lot of the clergy in France, instead of trying to follow the Roman Missal, they wanted to follow all these Gallican liturgical books, there was a lot of complications with that and everything. And so he really kind of paved the path, you might say, in France for, no, we need to return back to the Roman Missal. These Gallican liturgies, or even these neo-Gallican liturgies that were being just kind of invented from bits and pieces, that's not the way we should be going. In fact, you guys have probably heard a lot of the liturgy of Saint Hippolytus. And Saint Hippolytus, this is the same Saint Hippolytus who actually was an anti-pope. He died a martyr, and he died also reconciled to the actual pope. They died supposedly on the same day, in the mines of Sardinia, if I remember, the lead mines of Sardinia. But he had put together this text. Now, this text, by the way, is somewhat in dispute whether Hippolytus actually wrote it or not. For a while, people undisputedly thought he did. Now there's some academic criticism of that. Whether that's the case or not, it's interesting is that Hippolytus, as a bishop, had a reputation as an antiquarianist. This is the 4th century, by the way. This is the 4th century. This is how far back antiquarianism goes. Okay? Now, to address this, Pius XII says, quote, "The same reasoning holds in the case of some persons who are bent on the restoration of all the ancient rites and ceremonies indiscriminately. The liturgy of the early ages is most certainly worthy of all veneration, but ancient usage must not be more esteemed, suitable, and proper, either in its own right or in its own significance, for later times and new situations, on the simple ground that it carries the savor and aroma of antiquity. The more recent liturgical rites likewise deserve reverence and respect. They too owe their inspiration to the Holy Ghost, who assists the Church in every age, even to the consummation of the world. They are equally the resources used by the majestic spouse of Jesus Christ to promote and procure the sanctity of man. Clearly, no sincere Catholic, and this is really an important point here, clearly, no sincere Catholic can refuse to accept the formulation of Christian doctrine, more recently elaborated and proclaimed as dogmas by the Church, under the inspiration and guidance of the Holy Ghost, with abundant fruit for souls, because it pleases him to hark back to the old formulas. No more can any Catholic in his right senses repudiate existing legislation of the Church to revert to prescriptions based on the earliest sources of canon law. Just as obviously unwise and mistaken is the zeal of one who in matters liturgical would go back to the rites and uses of antiquity, discarding the new patterns introduced by disposition of divine providence to meet the changes of circumstances and situation. And we'll develop that point actually a little bit further when we even get to the new Mass to see exactly how that was contradicted. Now, Pius XII also corrected another excess, which was the promotion of objective and corporate acts of liturgy while rejecting the ones of a personal or subjective form of piety, such as religious exercises. And in fact, Pius XII mentioned specifically the Ignatian exercises, okay, which the Society of St. Pius X is a huge promoter of, all right? And in fact, he calls this error of distinguishing between personal and objective piety as pernicious. Pius XII also insisted that the liturgy must be subject to the Church's hierarchical authority. It is specifically being directed to experimentation that was taking place. Now, this is the ugliest side of the liturgical movement. Many of you have probably seen maybe pictures from the Mass of the Future, or the Mass in Transition, 2 books that were popular in the United States. And they show some of this going on. Some of it had some ecclesiastical approbation. Articles could be written on what they were. Some of these guys were of goodwill. They were trying to resolve what was pastoral problems. They weren't good solutions, okay? But some of these things were just going on and weren't supposed to. But Pius XII wanted to nip this in the bud, okay? Because this was starting to get out of control and it wasn't going to go to the right way. All right, so quote, "In every measure taken, then let proper contact with the ecclesiastical hierarchy be maintained. Let no one arrogate to himself the right to make regulations and to impose them on others at will. Only the sovereign pontiff, as the successor of St. Peter, charged by the divine Redeemer with the feeding of his entire flock, and with them, in obedience to the apostolic see, the bishops, quote, whom the Holy Ghost has placed to rule the Church of God, unquote, have the right and the duty to govern the Christian people. Consequently, venerable brethren, meaning the bishops, whenever you assert your authority, even on occasion with wholesome severity, you are not merely acquitting yourselves of your duty, you are defending the very will of the founder of the church, unquote. So we're going to go on now to some of the liturgical reforms that were made after the publication of Mediator Dei. And this is an important part because it's really important for us to make proper distinctions, understand what was occurring and why, and to specifically to understand that, look, the liturgical reforms that comprise the 1962 liturgical books have nothing to do with what happened in the Novus Ordo, even if some of the same people were involved. Okay? There's a huge demarking line there, and really what it comes down to is they didn't follow Mediator Dei. And the biggest one is, as we'll talk about the implementation of certain specific errors that made the difference between the 62 Missal versus the Novus Ordo. All right? And by the way, I may even say the 65 Missal is really the 62 Missal in text. There's some rubrical changes. There's some distinctions to make there. Okay? So one thing I want to mention, it's become recent, in the last few years, rather faddish for some popular people out on the internet to debunk the Holy Week reform of Pius XII, which was done in 1955, the 62 Missal, and even to go so far as to condemn the breviary reform of St. Pius X. All right? And these guys are calling for a return to the pre-1955 books. Now, in fact, this is actually a type of neo-antiquarianism. And the reason is, our primary reason for our adherence to the traditional Mass, to the Roman Mass, to the Mass of all time, the true Mass, you may even say, is due to the theological deficiencies of the new Mass. It's our first reason. It's not because we just like older practices. It happens that those older practices of the 62 Missal are in conformity with traditional doctrine. Okay? Otherwise, as a result, consequently, because our attachment is for theological reasons first, therefore we must also obey when a legitimate promulgation or reform has been made to the sacred liturgy. And this is the point that Archbishop Lefebvre made to the Sedevacantists IX here in the United States of America in 1983. They wanted to go back to the pre-55 books and said, the 62 Missal is bad. The 61 Breviary is bad. The Holy Week reform is bad. We want to go back to this other one. That's a safer route. And Archbishop Lefebvre said, no. Pius XII was legitimate. John XXIII was legitimate pope. They made legitimate promulgations, and nothing doctrinal was touched or affected. And that was the primary reason for their expulsion, by the way. It was not because of Sedevacantism. It was because the problems they were causing liturgically. You can go up to the sspx.org website. There's it's called Only When the Faith is in Question. And Archbishop Lefebvre addresses the seminarians at Ridgefield, why this happened, what happened, why these guys were expelled. And it's liturgical, first and foremost. It's there. I've gotten to actually listen to old tape cassette that was actually the recording that was actually made of those sessions. Unfortunately, there's a transcript available somewhere online. Unfortunately, the recordings have not been made available again. So this is why, in our attachment to tradition, we should be following the liturgical books that are supposed to be in use for the 1962 Missale Romanum, and not the prior ones, the pre-55, as these people want to put it. Our attachment to tradition is not because I like these older practices better, or, well, it's just more beautiful. Beauty is an aspect of truth, not the other way around. The reason we're attached to traditional Mass is because that's the truth. That's why we have the problem with the new Mass, because it either diminishes it, mutates it, obscures it, or even deletes it. And I should also mention that liturgical reform in the church is nothing new, and occurs often. Okay? And it should be organic, as in the life of the church, as attested by Pius XII in Mediator Dei. Quote, "The church is without question a living organism. And as an organism, in respect to the sacred liturgy also, she grows, matures, develops, adapts, and accommodates herself to temporal needs and circumstances, provided only that the integrity of her doctrine be safeguarded," unquote. So exactly what Archbishop Lefebvre is quoting as the principle when it comes to liturgical reforms. Some of you may not be aware of this or not. It's finally starting to kind of come out a little bit more, but St. Pius X had actually planned a general liturgical form. It was going to be pretty wide sweeping from what we know. Unfortunately, most of what had been talked about, and it's still locked up at the Vatican Secret Archives. We've never really had a chance to see it, but we have a pretty good idea what a lot of that was. Unfortunately, Pius X died before he can initiate. He did manage to promulgate a reformed breviary, which, trust me, priests do usually appreciate, because he made it much shorter. He made it also so that they could say all 150 Psalms throughout within the entire week. Okay, the older breviary, there had been a lot of complaints about how long it was, what a burden it was to the priests, that it was very difficult for them to carry on other aspects of their pastoral life, even making sick calls and stuff, because the breviary had become so convoluted with so much stuff. Pius X also codified canon law. I got to see, by the way, firsthand what that meant when I was up at the Benedictine College up in Atchison. They have a rare book area, and they let me in there. And they had literally shelves and shelves and shelves, about this high, all filled, packed with these huge antique volumes of Cajetan and all these other moral theologians and canonists. And this is what they had to codify into one nice little volume we have today. There's an enormous amount of work going on there. I should also mention that a lot of these reforms that we see going on in the 20th century, they had been long anticipated. They didn't just pop out of nowhere. In fact, Council of Trent never finished all of its work. I give you a concept of what was going on there with the Council of Trent. They had to fix the calendar, which, as many of you probably remember, may know this little historical fact. 13 days in October had to be wiped out one year just to catch up the calendar. So we had the Julian calendar, literally of Julius Caesar, and then they got the Gregorian calendar, okay, which was reformed. But interesting thing is, in the altar missal, if you were to open up, you'd actually see both calendars in there. For whatever reason, they continued to publish that all the way to 1962. The ancient calendar and the reformed calendar, Julian Gregorian, okay? That had to be fixed astronomically. That was a huge topic at the Council of Trent, believe it or not. Another thing was the breviary. The calendar of the breviary was out of sync with the missal. They had to resync it together. They spent 8 years restoring the breviary and only 5 with the missal. And it should be noted, too, that they were limited in what resources they had at that time for reference work. They did, in fact, go back to what they had at the Vatican archives at that time. But as I told you later, in the 19th and 20th century, all this stuff started coming out that were being discovered. All things here, there, and everywhere, which made things even more clear on what restoration work could be done. Okay, so like I said, some of these things that I'm going to talk about a few of them in just a minute here. Some of these reforms that came out in the 20th century had been long discussed. Okay, so there was a history of this. Now, the effort of liturgical reform was renewed after World War II, beginning literally in 1946, when Pius XII asked the Sacred Congregation of Rites to study the possibility of making a general liturgical reform again. Now, remember, this has already been done under St. Pius X. Now Pius XII is renewing this. The result was in 1948 the establishment of a pontifical commission for liturgical reform, sometimes known as the Pian Liturgical Commission. And its guiding document outlined 3 principles by which any liturgical reform should proceed. 1, a balance should be kept between the tendency simply to conserve and simply to innovate. This is exactly what Pope St. Gregory the Great, by the way, did when he reformed and codified the Roman canon about 600 AD. Took a little, changed a little, added a little. All right? 2, that because the liturgy is the worship of Almighty God, the cult of the saints should be subordinated to the temporal and ferial cycles in the liturgical calendar. Talk about that in a minute. And 3, that in keeping with the fact that the liturgy is an organic unity, reform should be similarly unitive and organic. Now, these are all good principles, and all of them get violated by the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, okay? And talk about that again later. I keep saying later. I hope you're still awake by then. Some people are. All right, so our 2 primary liturgical reforms of Pius XII that I want to mention that help to get a sense of what they're trying to accomplish. The first one is the Holy Week Restoration. The second one is the new code of rubrics for the Roman Missal and Breviary. The Holy Week Restoration, these things have been talked about for a while, even prior. The Easter Vigil was the first thing to come out, and it came out as experimentally in 1951, and it was very well received. People loved it. First thing, it restored the proper time of the vigil. This was the greatest vigil of the Catholic Church, and now it's being done at 10 o'clock in the morning. You're chanting Alleluia before you've even got to midnight. And by the way, in the middle of the day, the whole symbolic nature of the Paschal fire and the Paschal candle is completely lost. You're chanting Lumen Christi in a light-filled church. Okay? It's just kind of absurd, okay? And there have been complaints made about that over the centuries. Okay, so one of the biggest things about the Holy Week Restoration was to change to the proper times. That's the most obvious one. Holy Thursday, the Last Supper meal, being at the time of the Last Supper. Good Friday in the afternoon when our Lord actually passed away. And Easter Vigil, of course, as the supreme vigil of the Catholic Church. So it also restored the emphasis on primary matters of the rites of Holy Week. I'm actually going to be eventually writing an article showing this is what the Holy Week reform did. Everyone talks about what it took away, but no one ever talks about, well, what did it gain? And it gained a lot. It really did. And an example is the Easter Vigil. The Paschal candle happens to be one of my favorite all-time symbols of Catholicism. It represents Christ, how he illuminates us in the darkness. Okay, and it's bestowed with his 5 wounds, the Alpha, the Omega, the year. Okay, there's a very long history behind the Paschal candle, but to give you, if you went back to the pre-1955 rite, so first thing is in the morning, daylight. They light the Paschal fire, and they bless it. And then they light this thing what's called the triple reed, which is basically a big giant candle. It comes out with three spokes at the top, okay? This triple reed candle, some of these pre-55ers, they make such a big deal that it's gone in the 55 Holy Week. And I'm like, why? Because the very reason for that was Paschal candles. If any of you have been to Europe, for instance, you've seen maybe the permanent Paschal candle stands that are very tall, like at St. Clement's. Okay. Even, by the way, here at St. Michael's Church in Old Town, they have a Paschal candle stand. It's this huge neo-Gothic thing on wheels, and it's about 15 feet tall. Salisbury Cathedral in England, they reputedly had a Paschal candle that was 35 feet tall. So once it was in place, they couldn't move it. Later, Paschal candles became a lot shorter in stature, okay? And obviously that's presumed to happen in the 1955 Holy Week, right? Well, the reason for this triple reed candle was not only to make sure that, so it would entwine all these candles so you have a big, giant burning torch on top so the wind wouldn't blow it out, okay? But the other reason is so they could actually reach the candle. And in fact, you can see in various manuscripts and stuff where you see that's actually going on. They're using this triple reed thing. Eventually, what they began to do was attribute a Trinitarian symbolism to this triple reed candle. But in fact, that was arbitrary because that's not what his original reason or use was at all before. It was simply practical, so you could reach the top of the Paschal candle. So in the pre-55, what you have is they light this triple reed. You come processing into this church, which, by the way, is in complete daylight. And they start chanting Lumen Christi, light of Christ. You're not genuflecting to the Paschal candle, though. You're only genuflecting to just merely the flame. You're missing the entire complete symbolism that's there. So now, in the Reformed Holy Week, it's the Paschal candle that's actually carried. And the entire rite of blessing is done by the priest, not interspaced by a deacon while he chants the glorious exultet, or the Paschal Preconium, as they call it, which before was being broken up by the deacon going and doing stuff to the Paschal candle. Now the exultet is chanted without pause, okay, which is wonderful. It gives a great emphasis to this exaltation of this Paschal candle. So what you can see now, what they've done is they've now made the emphasis that really always should have been given to the Paschal candle, which is one of the main features of the entire Easter Vigil service. And that Paschal candle is going to follow us all the way until Ascension Thursday, when it's symbolically extinguished after the gospel because our Lord has now gone back up into heaven. That's just an example right there of what we have gained. Another thing we've gained at the Easter Vigil, something I absolutely love. It's really ridiculous. You get these people say, well, they introduced modernist innovations into the Easter Vigil. Really, the renewal of your baptismal promise is a modernist innovation? That's just ridiculous. And that's one of the beautiful new things that got added. Because what they said was the sense of who we are as Catholics, because we were all baptized as infants, and our godparents made the responses for us. When do we ever make that affirmation again, as we did at our baptism? And the idea was, the Easter Vigil is the great night of baptisms. Let's make the faithful renew their baptismal promises. Let's bring this back to the forefront. This is our Christian duty. This is our Christian life. This is what we have gained through our sacred baptism, which Christ himself earned through these redemptive acts of this night. Because he could have been just crucified and died, and that would have been it. Well, that doesn't make him God. It wouldn't have redeemed us. It's because he rose again from the dead on that night. That's what makes all those acts redemptive acts. It's the great mystery of our faith. So, and another beautiful thing that I love that they did. Just talk briefly about the new code of rubrics for the Roman Missal and the Breviary. These were published posthumously in 1960. Work had already kind of began under Pius XII. He died in 1958. The Sacred Congregation of Rites really didn't quite get to that work until 5960, but like I said, all this was being talked about. What it mainly did was reform the classification and rank system of the calendar. So now we have like a first class feast, second class feast, third class feast, fourth class feast, some vigils and octaves. Before, you had an extremely complicated system of classifications, doubles and minor doubles and semis, and it was just... I actually produced, if you see it on my table, the Ordo for the Traditional Roman Missal and Breviary. It's the original one since 1979. Just editing that alone is enough work. Okay, I would not want to go back to the pre-1960 rubrics of the class and ranks. It's just very confusing. All right. The other thing they accomplished with this classification reform was they restored the primacy of the temporal cycle over sanctoral. So what you had is, a lot of people complain, well, this feast day's gone, and that feast day's gone, or this feast got moved around, or this, that. Well, what they were trying to do was, the temporal cycle is essentially pointed to the Holy Trinity. We have the sanctoral cycle, which is the veneration of saints. But obviously, veneration of saints should be subordinate to that of the temporal. Well, it wasn't. The sanctoral cycle was constantly getting in the way. And it was trumping. In fact, one of the first great acts that was done was under St. Pius X. The Lenten ferials almost never got observed. They were always being trumped by what we consider as a third-class feast of a saint today. Okay, Pius X put an end to that by saying, no, from now on, Lenten ferials are basically third-class rank. Now today we see Lenten ferials and you have a commemoration of a saint, okay? But that was one of the first big steps. So imagine not being able to follow the ancient masses of Lent. Some of these go back at least to the 9th century. All right, and yet they couldn't enter into the life of us. It's supposed to be. So here's the other thing too, by the way. So the masses of Lent, the ferials of Lent, have that penitential character that we're supposed to be observing to get ready for Easter. Well, every day you have a feast day. That is what it is. It's a feast, and it carries with it liturgically that festive mode. So you have this absence of the penitential mode going on. All right, so that was something else they wanted to do. And so, yeah, you can complain about, they got rid of this vigil or that or this little thing or that. But ultimately, when you have an understanding of what they were trying to accomplish, they did actually a very, very good job, and with minimal intrusion into the Roman calendar. And like I said, a lot of these things had been considered for at least going back to Council of Trent. Okay, so it's nothing new. It wasn't spontaneous. And finally, one other thing I want to focus in on is, as Brian was kind enough to mention, one of my favorite things that happened was in 1962 when Pope John XXIII finally got St. Joseph's name inserted into the Roman canon. I gave a conference on this back in Houston at the Fatima Center a few months ago. It's now up on their website. You can YouTube it. But it was a very long process going back almost 150 years. It was the culmination of the theological development of Josephology. And this book, For the Insertion of St. Joseph's Name to the Prayers of the Mass, covers that development. And then I augmented it with some extra things that actually talk about the final petition to John XXIII, the people involved, what actually motivated him to do that. And so it's an excellent resource. I can tell you this was published in 1961, just a few months prior before it happened, which is why I augmented it with some extra stuff to catch you up. But this book is excellent for increasing your devotion to St. Joseph, which I think is absolutely crucial in this crisis of the church, because he is the protector of the universal church. All right, now some people want to characterize these reforms that led up to the 62 Missal as the beginning of the end, and what led to the Novus Ordo is the thin end of the wedge. They'll even go so far as to characterize these things as Bugnini Holy Week or Bugnini 1962 Missal. And I want to clarify something about that. So, fortunately for us, for a long time it's been said and stated that Bugnini did not actually have any real instrumental role at all, even though he was a secretary on the PN Commission. And now finally, we have some written sources that abundantly prove this to be the case. The first one that's come out just recently is Yves Chiron's biography called Annibale Bugnini. And we also have the diaries of Cardinal Antonelli, who was the actual president of one of these commissions of reforms. And they refute this constantly and say, this guy did nothing. He was a secretary at that point. He did good editing work. He was a good manager of personnel, so to speak, or managing the work that needed to be done. He was not a total idiot, okay? And he did, under Pius XII, he did some pretty good work in that. I'm actually in debt to him in one way, because he actually compiled all of the liturgical documents of the Reform into all these volumes, which had never been done before. He did that work himself, okay? But anyways, as I was going to say, the Bugnini of the Pian Liturgical Commission was extremely diametrically different from the one of Paul VI's Concilium. There's an absolute difference there. These guys who want to call it the Bugnini Holy Week make it sound like Bugnini had a daily audience with Pope Pius XII and was standing there holding his head at his deathbed at Castel Gandolfo. It's ridiculous. No, Bugnini had no access to Pius XII. Okay? He had constant access to Paul VI. That's been documented. We know that absolutely for sure. Furthermore, and I'd say most importantly, if we look at the reforms that comprise the 62 Missal, nothing doctrinal was affected, as attested by Archbishop Lefebvre. So let's say worst case scenario, Bugnini was the great initiator of all this, which he wasn't. What was touched? Broken clock, absolutely right, twice a day. And again, I want to mention to you, Archbishop Lefebvre was merely repeating to the Sede Vacantis the teaching of Pius XII of Mediator Dei, as long as the doctrine is held to. So now we're going to go and discuss how the Novus Ordo contradicts Mediator Dei. Now, Pius XII gave sound teaching and guidance on liturgical matters in the encyclical, and these were not followed by Pope Paul VI's Concilium in creating a new Mass, and we may say also the new sacraments, which Father Albert got to talk about at length. And this Catholic Family News Conference has been covering problems in the new Mass and will continue to do so. So I really just want to give a few points here because I don't want to beat a dead horse. So first, I want to encourage you to, after you leave this conference, please continue to educate yourself on what you have learned over this weekend from the various speakers. And there's some suggested reading I'd like to give you. The first one is the Atti Giovanni intervention, or brief critical study in the order of the Mass. It's available in book format from Angelus Press, but you can also read it online at sspx.org. Many of you may not be aware of this, but Archbishop Lefebvre was actually chaired that commission. He's the one that got it started. 2 noble Italian laywomen came to him to complain about the new order of the Mass that had been published, and they said, we will do whatever it takes to make this happen. And it was Archbishop Lefebvre who gathered the theologians together in a room in Rome somewhere, and they came up with the study, and then it ended up Cardinal Ottaviani and Bacci being the only prelates they actually wrote a preface to it, and they signed it and gave it to Pope Paul VI. Some books from Michael Davies, absolutely incredible English language author, which I think is essential reading on the part of the New Mass. First book, Pope Paul's New Mass, which is really a compilation of all the stuff he had done before. The Roman Rite Destroyed. Cranmer's Godly Order, which Brian McCall briefly talked about. Okay, this is where he actually compares Cranmer's Godly Order to what was done in the New Mass, and when you read them together, you're like, oh my. All right, and those are all available from Angelus Press. Then you have The Mass of All Time by Archbishop Lefebvre, available from Angelus Press. And again from Michael Davies, but only available through Amazon, is Liturgical Time Bombs in Vatican II. I don't want to get into Sancta Sanctum Concilium as a document, how it's flawed, the time bombs that were there, because it's what actually led to the New Mass. Again, they're not obeying Mediator Dei. And you can talk about Sancta Sanctum Concilium and say, yes, there's these good points here that weren't followed by the New Mass. To me, that doesn't really matter for this conference in any case. Now, the proponents of the New Mass will claim that it's in conformity with Mediator Dei. They'll claim that the liturgical movement met its climax with the formation of the Novus Ordo Missae, and in fact, the active participation that was always sought, you'll find it in the New Mass. Well, I think Dr. Child's wonderful musical conference debunked that whole idea, okay, at least from the musical standpoint, all right? Now, what's interesting is when you look at Mediator Dei and read it, everything that the encyclical condemns is found in the New Mass. It's just unbelievable. So just to give some brief examples, 1, not adhering to the rule of lex credendi, lex orandi. So in the New Mass, it was declared objective to implement false ecumenism in the prayers of the Mass, to diminish the Catholicity in the prayer texts. This was a declared goal of Bugnini in 1965 to avoid stumbling blocks of ecumenism with the Protestants. And they went one step further. They employed 6 Protestant ministers to directly assist in creating the New Mass, something that neocons like to try to wiggle out of and say, oh, they were just observant. No, that's not why they were being thanked by Pope Paul VI in that picture you see published in Le Observatorio Romano in 1975. He thanks them for their assistance and participation. That doesn't sound like it being just a mere observer to me. Besides, we also have the interview of Michael Davies with the Anglican minister Jaspers, who details at great length how they contributed to the New Mass. So, as I like to say, the Protestant proof is in the pudding. The biggest proof of all, of course, is the fact that after they published the New Mass, various Protestant sects decided to adopt the New Mass almost verbatim. And you have Protestants declaring on its publication, wonderful that the erroneous natures of sacrifice have been purged. There is nothing in this new order of the Mass that should offend an evangelical Protestant. It goes on. Le Observatorio Romano, the Vatican's own newspaper, even prints comments like this. It's indisputable, the Protestant nature that exists in the New Mass. And, of course, more of this, it gets worse because they even minimize the theological notions of the 4 ends, heaven, hell, purgatory, sin, wages of death, suffering for sanctification, and the fact that some of these saints actually died for the faith. They were martyred for the faith, okay? And yes, the people that were persecuting them were some of these, Protestants, barbarians, pagans, and yes, so you must believe in the Catholic faith to get to heaven. 2, employing the error of antiquarianism. So there was this insistence on reviving older, less developed liturgical texts. I mentioned about the Liturgy of St. Hippolytus as one of them. Now, the Liturgy of St. Hippolytus, if it actually was used in the 4th century, was perfectly fine for that time. Because at that time, Christianity wasn't fractured by a Protestant Reformation. Everyone believed what they were supposed to believe, so to speak, about the priesthood, the sacrificial nature of the Mass, the real presence of the Blessed Sacrament, the sacrificial nature of the Mass, being an unbelievable renewal of Calvary. These things were not held in dispute. The problem is, so they're not emphasized in the texts, like you see in the 1962 Missal, at the offertory, or in the canon. They weren't as well developed. They were over time, and that was to combat the errors, as well as our belief, to also increase our belief in these things as time went on. Well, these members of the concilium continually wanted to go back to the text of the Liturgy of St. Hippolytus and others from the East, which is fine for them, but doesn't really work out for us in the West. Okay, the topic could be, a conference could be given on that. Because those texts were so ambiguous today. They weren't ambiguous then in the 4th century. They are today because of the Protestant Reformation and all the other stuff. And, of course, that would serve their ecumenical agenda. Look, Protestants can accept the Liturgy in St. Hippolytus. We know the Anglicans will. We know the Lutherans will. Maybe we can get some of these other guys to as well. This is perfect for our objective. Other examples, and I'm going to quote directly from Mediator Dei, and you see this absolutely in the Novus Ordo today. Quote, "Thus, to cite some instances, one would be straying from the straight path were he to wish the altar restored to its primitive table form. Were he want to have black excluded as a color for the liturgical vestments. Were he to forbid the use of sacred images and statues in churches. Were he to order the crucifix so designed that the divine Redeemer's body shows no trace of his cruel sufferings. And lastly, were he to disdain and reject polyphonic music or singing in parts, even where it conforms to regulations issued by the Holy See," unquote. And third, introducing, or rather shoving down our throats, an improper form of active participation. And they did this by asserting that the faithful possess a royal priesthood. Oh, you're offering the sacrifice with the priest as the priest. Which, of course, one of the main points of Mediator Dei is that Pius XII is teaching against this. Introducing a humanist-centric liturgy by mainly having altar facing the people. Other things as well, too. The de facto forbiddance of Latin. Now, of course, the Novus Ordo Missae is in Latin. The original text was in Latin, but it all gets translated into vernacular. When was the last time you heard Latin in the Novus Ordo? Very little. I remember the first time I heard it, they sang the one little phrase, Gloria in excelsis Deo, ad in veritas, and I was excited. Latin! What? You know, you never get to hear it, okay? The rest of the song was in English, all right? So, quote, Pius XII addresses in Mediator Dei, "The use of the Latin language, customary in a considerable portion of the Church, is a manifest and beautiful sign of unity, as well as an effective antidote for any corruption of doctrinal truth. In spite of this, the use of the mother tongue in connection with several of the rites may be of advantage to the people, but the Apostolic See alone is empowered to grant this permission." And obviously, they went way too far with this concession of vernacular. Even Archbishop Lefebvre was saying, you know, the vernacular could possibly be used for the readings at the Mass as pastoral consideration. But the whole liturgy in the vernacular? No. Okay? Also, the wholesale omission of Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony, which we've already seen. Again, in Mediator Dei, Pius XII slams that error. Now, just trying to conclude this talk here, I want to talk briefly about going forward with the legitimate goals or work of the liturgical movement amongst ourselves, as mentioned in Mediator Dei. Start out with a quote. "It is therefore desirable, venerable brethren, that all the faithful should be aware that to participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice is their chief duty and supreme dignity, and that not in an inert and negligent fashion, giving way to distractions and daydreaming, but with such earnestness and concentration that they may be united as closely as possible with the high priest, according to the apostle, quote, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus," unquote. "And together with him and through him, let them make their oblation, and in union with him, let them offer up themselves," unquote. So the first point is, the restoration of these principles or practices of active participation are not revolutionary. They do not have anything to do with the new Mass. The new Mass hijacked correct principles, correct things, and abused them, went the wrong way. So we're merely restoring traditional practices our ancestors would have done once upon a time. And the popes have given us the guidelines for implementing all this, from St. Pius X up to Pius XII. In fact, Pius XII, shortly, just actually a few days before he died, there was an instruction on sacred music and liturgy that was published, which is a terrific document. And it goes in there and it establishes all the guidelines and rules, okay, for congregational singing, for the dialogue Mass, okay, those kind of things. Now, concerning traditional Mass, it's on the rise. We have effectively come out of the catacombs. We've reached a critical mass, pun intended, and there is no turning back. And we have the liberals on the run, and I'm so happy. There was just the other day an article in that the Fish Wrap, the National Catholic Reporter, which is down the street from where I live. And they were flipping out because there was a parish where the Institute of Christ the King was actually invited in, and well, some of the parishioners just didn't quite like what they were doing, and so National Catholic Reporter, in their typical reporting style on anything traditional or conservative, had to, of course, do what they did and make them seem like they were a bunch of freaks and and anything. So they're obviously trying to push back, but they have limited success now. They have limited success. I have to say that. Every day we turn around and there's somebody else who has now become convinced to some degree or another of returning to tradition. So Michael Davies' prediction that the traditional Mass would be the Mass of the future is definitely coming true. However, that being said, we should not be content with just merely having low Masses for tradition. We should attempt to ever increase the use of sung Masses. And to quote Pius XII on this point from Mediator Dei, quote, "So that the faithful take a more active part in divine worship, let Gregorian chant be restored to popular use in the parts proper to the people. Indeed, it is very necessary that the faithful attend the sacred ceremonies, not as if they were outsiders or mute onlookers, but let them fully appreciate the beauty of the liturgy and take part in the sacred ceremonies, alternating their voices with the priest and the choir, according to the prescribed norms. If, please God, this is done, it will not happen that the congregation hardly ever, or only in a low murmur, answer the prayers in Latin or in the vernacular. A congregation that is devoutly present at the sacrifice, in which our Savior together with his children, redeemed with the sacred blood, sings the nuptial hymn of his immense love, cannot keep silent, for song befits the lover. And as the ancient saying has it, quote, "He who sings well prays twice," unquote. Thus, the church militant, faithful as well as clergy, joins in the hymns of the church triumphant and with the choirs of angels, and all together sing a wondrous and eternal hymn of praise to the most holy Trinity, in keeping with words of the preface, quote, "With whom our voices too thou wouldst bid to be admitted," unquote. And continuing, "We also exhort you, venerable brethren, to promote with care congregational singing, and to see to its accurate execution with all due dignity, since it easily stirs up and arouses the faith and piety of large gatherings of the faithful. Let the full harmonious singing of our people rise to heaven, like the bursting of a thunderous sea, and let them testify by the melody of their song to the unity of their hearts and minds as becomes brothers and the children of the same Father," unquote. So these exhortations simply represent the authentic vision of the liturgical movement. And as I spoke in last year's conference here, on the importance of the Roman Mass, it was the sung Masses that converted the barbarians, the pagans, to Christianity. So what can we do as laity? The first thing is educate ourselves. We can restore these practices amongst ourselves. As a personal example, I came from the Novus Ordo. When I attended my first traditional Mass, I did not know the Kyrie modes. I did not know how to sing a Kyrie Creed or the Gloria. I did know the Asparagus. And that was courtesy of, there's a gentleman here, his mother actually lent me a DVD, a video of the traditional Mass. I taught myself the Asparagus off that Mass, off that video of the Mass, okay? But I rapidly tried to learn and memorize the various Kyrie modes, okay? It's easy to do today, by the way. We have YouTube. There are so many videos out there that have these Gregorian chant hymns or the Kyries, the Glorias, the Credos. They have it with the chant notation there and the lyrics underneath. You can follow it. They're there for your instruction, okay? You can even, if you want to buy a Liber Usualis and a Liber Brevior and use that to follow it at Mass too. And sometimes the chant is actually in the back of your missal. Again, study the liturgy. It's the wellspring of our sanctification. And one way you can do that is with your hand missal. You can study the text before or after Mass and contemplate upon them and gain more benefit from those texts, okay? How about all those saints that get mentioned during the Roman canon? I have another book on that. It's called The Saints Who Pray With Us in the Mass. Come back to my table, okay? So anyways, this is just one more way we can unite ourselves with our great saints, our great friends in heaven. Another thing, learn some Latin. It's our Roman culture, our Catholic culture. It's who we are. We are Roman Catholics. Romans didn't speak Rome. They spoke Latin. Okay? That's our liturgy. Why do we go to it if we don't even attempt to learn something of it? I find it mind-boggling that our supposed ignorant ancestors, who probably were illiterate, probably couldn't read or write, but you know what? History testifies they often knew the Latin of the Mass. They could follow it to some degree or another. They even knew Vespers. Because when you hear the same Vesper psalms being sung over and over again, because you're going to the monastery almost every single day, or at least every Sunday, because at that time in some places it was considered part of your Sunday obligation to attend Sunday Vespers, you're going to assimilate it like a sponge, especially if you started as a child and you end up there as an old man, okay? So why can't we relearn some Latin? I did. I never knew any Latin. I just learned it. Can I speak it fluently? No. But I know enough that I can close my missal, and if the priest is pronouncing it correctly, guess what? I can pretty much understand what he's saying. All right? Men as leaders, by the way, just throw out, how much time do you spend devoted to sports, and how much time do you spend developing your liturgical skills? Okay? And to that extent, I would say, if you want to learn how to make the responses in Latin, guess what? I have a little card. You can learn how to pronounce them in Latin, okay? So it's not just for servers, okay? All right? Another thing is, another resource I offer is, by the way, this Mass assistance card for low Mass, high Mass, all Mass, so you want to know when you should actually properly sit, stand, and kneel. This was actually researched, and it's actually according to the rubrics, so you can get that at my table too, all right? I want to encourage you guys, push for sung Masses. And don't just push your pastors, hey, could we have more sung Masses? Can we do that? But get involved. I don't know how many times I hear complaints everywhere, I can't get any men to sing. I can't get any singers. So therefore, we can't fulfill what St. Pius X had desired in his motu proprio on sacred music, which was the restoration of all male scholas, because it's supposed to be a liturgical office of men and boys singing in cassock and surplice. That's what we're supposed to be aiming for as the ideal. That's what he wanted to see restored, okay? And again, I got to give it out to the men, we got to get more involved. It's not just something we do on a Sunday. And maybe it is, maybe the only traditional Mass you ever get is a Sunday. but get more involved in that. I know some people make great sacrifices to get to where they're at. You know, they drive at least an hour. I live 30 seconds away, so I'm all right, okay? So I still have trouble because I have 4 kids and they don't want to behave at Mass. They don't want to obey Mediator Dei. They're distracted and everything. Final conclusion. So I hope this conference has provided some appreciation of Pius XII's magnificent encyclical Mediator Dei. Again, please go read it. I also hope I've been able to provide some clarifications on certain important points, particularly that the liturgical movement had many good things to offer, and we should be carrying on that work, okay? That active participation is, in fact, a legitimate objective in practice. It's traditional. That the liturgical reforms to the 62 Missal and its other liturgical books cannot in any way be equated to the revolution of the Novus Ordo. And finally, that the new Mass does indeed contradict Mediator Dei, specifically on several points. And to conclude, I'm really glad that Brian here brought up in his conference about the persecution of the English, because I want to conclude also with what the English Catholics said during their persecution, which was, keep the faith, and so therefore remember, it's the Mass that matters.